Sometimes, especially in summer, I feel the need to seek out cool places beneath old trees, oaks or Scots pines for preference. And because it's summer and because I live in Scotland and because summer in Scotland and trees are the component parts of an equation that equals midges, I like my cool places beneath old trees to be open spaces and high rather than low-lying and near enough to the edge of the wood to permit access for the wind, the better to keep me cool and move the midges along. Here is one such open space, in a pine and oak wood that reaches 1,000 feet uphill on both sides of a mountain river to a trinity of waterfalls. So water voices carry to me on an easy wind, and that adds to the allure. But right now, I just want the good Highlands summer green that dresses the space beneath the trees. I know from many years of practice that this here and now with my back to an old oak trunk, sitting as still as I know how with the wind in my face, this open invitation to nature to drop in and spend the time of day with me, is as likely to bear fruit as absolutely anything else I can think of. Then the roe deer, the doe. She walked from tree shadows where dusk had begun to gather into the one patch of that small clearing where the last of the sunlight caught her, and there she stopped, and there she stood, and there she glowed. But the reddening sun was only on her head and neck and spine and the top half of her left flank. The rest of her was dark. She presented an almost eerie illusion, as if the top half of a roe deer was swimming through the trees and the woodland understory. When she stopped, she floated. How long before she would see me? She was still then, apart from her ears, and these flickered with a restlessness that belied her outward calm. The ears looked too big for the size of her head, and they were pale grey, almost white, when they turned towards me, and trimmed with a sharp lace of black. With these she tested every airt of the woodland and far beyond. But I knew the wind worked in my favour. So did my stillness and my woodland-shaded clothes, yet something gave me away, and her head swung round, and I was pinned to the oak tree by her double-barrelled, black-eyed stare. So I had the answer to my own question, how long before she would see me, and that answer was about 20 seconds. The fact is that despite all the care I routinely take in such a situation, the deer is better attuned. She is of the woods and I am not. Each time I come back here or somewhere like it, I have to reacclimatise, shed influences from beyond the woods that, inevitably, I bring with me. And I'm willing to bet that she will have known that I was here long before she trusted my stillness enough to cross the clearing and pause in that last scrap of evening sunlight. A lesson falls into place here, a kind of first commandment, and it cannot be repeated too often. It is that in all our dealings with wildlife, from watching a roe deer cross a clearing on a summer evening to reintroducing lost species, say wolf, beaver, sea eagle, with consequences that will endure for hundreds of years, it always takes time. And mostly giving the required time to watch and learn and understand, letting nature take its course, is where our side of the bargain falls short. The doe turned from side on to head on, and as she did so that low and intense sunlight travelled across her as she realigned head and neck and chest and back, until only her face and chest were brightly lit, lending her a faintly ghostly air. I wondered why she had turned like that. What I expected was that she would turn to face away from me, then turn her head back to look at me down the length of her spine, ready for flight. But this had the air of something more confrontational, or perhaps just more contemplative, weighing up my threat or absence of threat. Then she stamped one forefoot, a soft thud like a muffled drumbeat. Was that for my benefit, an invitation to leave the premises? Or else a signal? A juniper bush shivered, and her fawn materialised from its dark green fleece and came to stand alongside her. A perfect miniature mirror image, except that it lacked the sunlit patches, being completely in shadow. The fawn could have been no more than 2 months old, yet she had obviously acquired from her mother the art of the disconcerting stare. The penetrating effect of those 4 unblinking eyes pinning me to the tree amounted to rather more than the sum of the parts. The watcher watched. It is a circumstance that always unnerves, and I never understand why. Was this not exactly what I sought to achieve? An engagement with nature on an equal footing, creatures of the same landscape. I studied their double act. What were they thinking? Were they thinking at all? Then, without a sound, they both turned to the right as if it was a well-rehearsed manoeuvre, walked beyond the sunlight to a more open patch of ground, a distance of no more than 20 yards. And without another glance, they both started to browse. The doe constantly raised her head to look back, but I gave her nothing, no cause for alarm. I was oak tree still. I hoped that the warmth and the admiration I felt for her and her offspring in that place at that moment would transmit, that she would catch the sense of it and relax. If I'm honest, I envied them their place on this wooded hillside, for they had an involvement with it, an intimacy with this land that everything else that lived and breathed there, an intimacy that is light years beyond anything I might ever hope to achieve. Then they moved off silently into the trees. With their disappearance, I considered what I had just seen and the dilemma that it had just dropped in my lap. And this is part of the nature writer's condition. For in my head were the words of an old friend called Don McCaskill. Don was a forester, the Forestry Commission's chief forester for the Strathire Forest, and a very untypical one at that. He was a brilliant naturalist, an award-winning wildlife photographer. He hand-reared foxes. His darkroom walls were lined with photographs of wolves. The words that made me realise quite early on in our friendship that he did not quite fit the mould of a Forestry Commission chief forester were these. A forest is not a forest without deer. And of course he was right. The corollary of that is also true. A deer is not a deer without forest. I watched the last of the light fade from the clearing. I've always loved that hour when daylight turns to dark, especially high summer dark, which on the Highland edge means a bluish-grey half-light. Eventually, just as I was about to leave, the unmistakable voice of the roebuck boomed into the clearing and hung on the air, deep and throaty, 2 harsh syllables designed to put the fear of death into any other roebuck within earshot. Fear of death is only a slight exaggeration. Few creatures the length and breadth of wild Scotland defend their territory as uncompromisingly as a mature roebuck in high summer, for that is also the roe mating season. I watched his silhouette follow precisely the line taken by the doe a few minutes before. She was somewhere out there just ahead of him in the gloom, but he knew precisely where. There's a dead oak tree, a runt, not far away, and stamped into the grass around that tree is a perfect circle, the ring of the roe deer mating season, where buck follows doe in a ritualized merry-go-round of salacious intent. I'd seen him earlier in the day as he crossed a patch of brilliantly sunlit bracken, and he was a beast in his prime, and lord of his manor. There are places in the lowlands where roe deer numbers are a problem, but on the edge of the mountains and in woodlands like this, you do well to get a view like that. But the glimpse of his silhouette as the gloaming gathered around the edge of the clearing, for he had paused where she paused, scenting her progress. That was the prize. That was the glorious moment of confirmation of Don's words, and what a photograph he would have made of the moment. I simply kept it in my head until it was time to write it down. A forest is not a forest without deer, and the deer is not a deer without the forest. Never was, never will be.